Follow Penny away whenever you want here. You can either wait for the beginning of the sermon if you want, or just go right now. And Bromleigh, I know that you have been waiting for this day for months.
It is because I really like bounce houses.
We have a bouncy house?
We do. It's right out there, and everybody should go visit it after the service. All of you are welcome.
I thought maybe you were excited about this day because you're such a Hamilton fangirl. You've been trying to get me to listen to the soundtrack for months.
Yeah, you got me. I am so excited about our Broadway and the Bible series, and even more excited about kicking it off with Hamilton. And you can see why, right? I mean, that was awesome. I've been a fan since I saw that clip we showed at the opening of the service when the cast performed for the Grammys. I remember clearly walking over to Josh at our family computer, pulling up the link and saying, "You have got to see this."
So what was it that impressed you so much?
Like everything about it. The precision of the language, the glory of those rhythms, the fact that all these founding fathers and mothers were being portrayed by people of color. Miranda and the casting team thought, this is a story about America, told by America now. And we want to eliminate any distance. Our story should look the way our country looks. Now, as someone who pretty regularly tells ancient stories for modern audiences, this is something that I get. Plus, it's a Broadway musical with hip hop, so I can nerd out and still be cool.
Yeah, right. You're super cool. But anyway, hip hop is really more than just a stylistic choice in this show, isn't it? It's not just like an attempt to be relevant in the world today. Hip hop is integral to the story. Lin-Manuel Miranda, in case you don't know that name, the author of Hamilton, an absolute genius, of course. He read Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Hamilton while he was on vacation, and he thought, wow, this is a hip-hop story.
And what, pray tell, makes a hip-hop story for those in the audience not as well-versed in this homegrown art form?
Well, being an expert on hip-hop myself, I would say what Miranda said when he was interviewed on 60 Minutes. He said, I got to the part of the biography where a hurricane destroyed St. Croix in the Caribbean where Hamilton is living. And Hamilton writes a poem about the carnage. And people are so impressed with his writing that this poem gets him off the island. That is part and parcel of the hip-hop narrative, Manuel Miranda wrote. Writing your way out of your circumstances. Writing the future you want to see for yourself. This is a guy who wrote at age 14, I wish there was a war. Writing from that level of desperation, it doesn't get more hip-hop than that.
I can imagine that part doesn't actually sit all that well with you, wishing for a war.
Right. As probably all these people know, I'm no fan of the myth of redemptive violence, but that theme, for some reason, didn't really bother me in the play because Hamilton's not really looking for a fight. He's not angry or out for blood. He's young, scrappy, and hungry, as the song we just heard says over and over again. When he's young, he has sort of this romantic vision of war as a chance to, again, as the show says, show everyone that we're more than anyone bargained for. So he's hungry for an opportunity to become something, to pursue his dream.
So this is a hip-hop story then, an immigrant story. He's from the West Indies, an American story. But one of the reasons I think it has such broad appeal, one of the reasons that I love it so much, is that it combines the political and the personal so beautifully. It's this broad story, but it's also a human story. And it nods to the kinds of hopes and dreams and failures that we find in the Bible too. As you said, Hamilton had this dream of making a difference in the world, of not being overlooked. But he came from nothing. He was abandoned by his father. His mother died when he was young. He knew what poverty and hunger felt like. And there was little opportunity in Charleston, in the town where he grew up. Later on, he struggles with what it means to be a good husband and father. He has deep regrets. And at the end, when he dies in a stupid, easily avoidable duel, it is not at all clear that he is proud of the life he has lived. So the whole show is both deeply inspiring and yet leaves a lot of open questions.
Yeah, that personal stuff that was part of the show that really surprised me the most. And of course touches you in such deep ways, but it's an occupational hazard. I've also been thinking about the biblical themes that come out in the show. Penny Davey noted some of the similarities in the introduction that she gave to the Deuteronomy passage earlier. Much of colonial America felt like they were living in bondage, just as the people of the Bible were living in bondage in Egypt. Both peoples experienced a kind of deliverance, but both found that leaving slavery is only part of the beginning of freedom. Hamilton and the Bible seem to have very different ideas of what freedom really is. Very different ideas of what the promised land, as it's referred to in that My Shot song, what the promised land is all about. In the Bible, freedom is freedom for following God's way in the world, while for Hamilton, freedom is, now, probably to oversimplify, just the ability to do whatever you want without hindrance.
In that way, Hamilton wasn't alone. Europeans had seen this new world as a perfect blank slate for freedom for generations by then, a place that God had ordained for them to inhabit, whether in pursuit of religious or economic or political freedom, because they saw their goal as so noble they could convert, enslave, or kill those they found already living here in pursuit of what they believed was a manifest destiny, God's desire for them to pursue a new life in the promised land. And while we might like to think that the Bible is free of such ugliness, the ways the people of God recorded this journey reveals otherwise. The land Moses hears about, the land promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that land was already inhabited too, and they did not always make nice with their new neighbors on arrival. They claimed divinely ordained ownership of a land that already belonged, insofar as land can belong, to others.
Hamilton's thought was kind of unique, though, in some ways. Slavery in the West Indies, where he grew up, was often even more savage than in the original 13 colonies. Slave lives, especially in that area, came so cheap that they were considered to be practically disposable, with not even the sort of barest economic interest to quell the master's brutality. Alexander Hamilton then became an early abolitionist, and he argued fervently against the spread of slavery in the colonies of the new United States. And we hear from him in My Shot, the song that I'm sure you understood every word of earlier. Hamilton was concerned about the threat of anarchic violence in this new land. He longed for freedom and opportunity, but he worries about what will happen when the colonists claim their independence and form that promised land.
He sings these words, and I tell you, I practiced like 6 times planning to attempt to rap these for you, but I am deciding that you didn't understand them before, so I'm going to just go real slow as a favor to you all so that you can understand each one and not attempt.
Of course, you could do it perfectly.
I could rap it, obviously.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Awesomely. So he says, if we win our independence, is that a guarantee of freedom for our descendants? Or will the blood we shed begin an endless cycle of vengeance and death with no defendants? It's such good poetry, though, right? You can hear them. I know the action in the street is exciting, but Jesus, between all the bleeding and fighting I've been reading and writing, we need to handle our financial situation. Are we a nation of states? What's the state of our nation? So the U.S. manages to avoid in those early years the endless cycle of violence that followed the French Revolution, and we'll hear more on that next week when we hear Les Mis. But certainly it persists in another violence, slavery, in violence in other ways. Slavery, despite the efforts of Hamilton and John Lawrence, and against Native Americans.
Hamilton and many of the folks in those early days were what we call deists. Maybe you've heard that term before. Their understanding of God is not exactly traditional Christianity. They thought of God as sort of a divine clockmaker who created the world long ago and put all the parts together, the cogs and the springs that make it all work properly, but then God checked out and just left the watch, that is the universe, to run on its own. It might possibly periodically need winding, but for the most part, God wasn't involved. Hamilton then was particularly concerned with getting the nation set up properly, getting the cogs and springs in place, you might say, contending with the financial situation that he was so worried about, the centralizing of authority. Hamilton thought that if these things could be worked out, then the nation would be the promised land, and he would secure his legacy for all time, which is nice.
A handy side thing. But even there's a kind of parallel with the Bible. In the Bible, the law is supposed to give the structure and guidance the people need to live as truly free in the promised land. And if the people followed the law, they would be truly free, and their society would be just and peaceful. That's what Hamilton wanted also. A just and peaceful society, and for his name to be known for the ages. But still, their promised lands were different. It's complicated, as Mike always says.
Good, got it.
Right?
Yes.
Maybe you can say, for the Bible, freedom only comes through faithfulness. And for Hamilton, faithfulness could only come through freedom.
Yeah, I think that's right. For the Bible, freedom only comes through faithfulness. But for Hamilton and so many others, faithfulness could only come after freedom. But the good news of our faith, the good news that we have to share together as God's people, is that God is not done with our community or with our world. God isn't really a clockmaker like the deists thought of God. God doesn't set the rules like the law in the Old Testament and then check out. In spite of our ongoing ability to mess it all up, over and over again, God gives us a vision of what that promised land is supposed to look like. God shows us that the land of milk and honey flows with the rivers of justice, goodness, and attention to the will of God. And the Bible makes clear right from the beginning, from the first call of Abraham, that the followers of God are supposed to be a blessing to the world, even to strangers and enemies.
Blessed to be a blessing, right?
Blessed to be a blessing.
God leads the people of Israel to a promised land and makes a covenant with them. And while it endures, it is not a one and done sort of thing. God remains. God loves steadfastly and renews those covenants over and over again. So God's blessing is for all people. God makes covenant with humanity throughout the ages and asks for our response, individually in each of our lives and collectively as communities of faith.
And really, in a lot of ways, that's what the musical Hamilton is all about, our shot, our response to this call of God. Over the next weeks and months, our congregation is going to be considering what we are called to do together for our communities, our Before We Get to Mars project, and a lot of the other stuff going on in the life of our congregation. We live right now in a moment that is rife with division and fear and doubt, and we are called to do in partnership with God the shaping of the world into the promised land of justice and opportunity for all people. With each new generation, with each passing season in the life of the church, we're called to make the world as right as we can for others, to live in the ways of justice and compassion in the way of Jesus, according to the will of God. We are called to pass on the promises of God to our children and all children. God has laid the sure foundation, and our God will guide us onward and upward so that we can fulfill that vision. My friends, you have a shot to proclaim the will of God, to be part of the doing of the will of God. And just as Hamilton was so excited to take his shot, I pray that all of us will be just as excited to take our shot at following the way of God, creating the promised land as God's people for all people. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.